Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. If you have horses or access to horse manure, you might want to use that manure to fertilize your plants. But what are the precautions you need to take before you break out that big shovel? America's favorite retired college horticulture professor, Debbie Flower, has those warnings for you. Wildfires. They're a fact of life throughout many rural and not so rural areas of states throughout the West, Northwest, Southwest, and the South. 1 in 6 Americans lives in an area that could face a wildfire. How can you protect your property to slow down the chance of damage from flying, burning embers? We talk with a University of California wildfire specialist on easy steps you can take to protect your home and modify your landscape to ease the wildfire threat. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Let's go. We like to answer your garden questions here on the Garden Basics podcast. There's a lot of ways to get in touch with us. You can leave an audio question without making a phone call via SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/Garden Basics and yell at your phone or your computer and we'll hear your question. It's the miracle of the 21st century. You can use a phone and call us 916-292-8964, 916-292-8964. There's a contact box where you can leave a question at gardenbasics.net. On email, sure, send it to fred@farmerfred.com. You can also leave a message at the Facebook site, Get Growing with Farmer Fred, or at Twitter, which is @FarmerFred, or Instagram, which is Farmer Fred Hoffman. Be my guest. A lot of ways to get questions in. Debbie Flower is here. See, I don't have a problem with questions. She does all the work. Debbie Flower is here, America's favorite retired college horticultural professor, and we hear from Ken down in Galt, which is in southern Sacramento County, and he says, my granddaughters have acquired 2 horses. I have a large garden and would love to use the manure, but I don't know how to compost it. Can you give me some tips or suggest a book or a website for me about horse manure? And you're absolutely right. Horses produce a heck of a lot of manure. I was amazed at looking at the figures about how much manure that horses can produce, and it's a small mountain eventually if you don't do something about it. So I think composting would be a good idea, Debbie.
Yeah, it's something, I think I read 50 pounds a day per horse.
Yeah.
So that, yes, that's quite a bit of manure. Composting is going to involve a small tractor of some sort, front end loader, something like that, because composting is a process where you're going to pile it up outdoors or preferably under a roof.
Would you do it in your, the spare bedroom in your house so the kids don't move back in?
No. Obviously, manure has fragrances that are not real desirable to most people. You don't want the manure exposed to a lot of rain because it's going to wash away all the good stuff, particularly the nitrogen. And it can end up then flooding places with manure water that don't want to be flooded. So you're going to have to store the manure somewhere and pile it up and create the desirable nitrogen to carbon ratio, which tends to be a lot more carbon than nitrogen. So including the barn sweepings is a very positive thing in this compost pile. And then turning it regularly. You want the compost pile to get up to 140 degrees. You need a long shanked thermometer. They are sold in garden supply places. Probably, well, it depends how big your pile is, but they come with, 24-inch shanks?
Well, you get 36-inch
36-inch shanks, and they have a round dial on the end. And when you go in and the center is 140 degrees and you leave it for a couple of days till it starts to decline in temperature, that means that the microorganisms working it have done their business, and then you turn it. You turn it so that the outside of the pile goes into the center of the pile goes in the outside. Obviously, that's a little difficult to tell, but you turn it and then leave it again, check the temperature. When it gets back to 140, leave it a couple of days. When it starts to decline, you go through the process again. And that will take potentially dangerous things out of the manure, like weed seeds
And there's a lot of ways you can design that compost pile, too. You mentioned the roof. If need be, you could cover it with a tarp, but as long as you turn it, it'll be okay and get oxygen through there. Mm-hmm. And you may only need to tarp it when rain is predicted.
Right.
So you have that advantage going for you. One of my favorites is the 3-bin method. We'll have instructions for that in the show notes today. University of California came up with that, and it's basically finished compost in as little as 2 weeks, although Debbie likes to brag that they did it in less time than that.
We did because we turned it daily. It wasn't a manure pile. It was garden clippings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And?
It was about 10 days or a week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it went from looking like celery to looking like fine
compost.
Soil.
You could not identify plants in it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. That's all you want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there was a composting experiment place in Tucson, Arizona, which is an incredibly dry place most of the year. And they tried different methods, this was for homeowners, so they were small, different containers and different inputs. You do need some moisture in the compost pile, like a wrung out sponge. So it's not a lot, and it needs oxygen, and it obviously needs the nitrogen and the carbon components, which you will get with the barn sweepings and the manure. But they found that the number one thing that was the limiting factor in the speed of the breakdown of the compost was oxygen. So, because there's lots of microorganisms in there working their little butts off, and they need to breathe. And that's when the temperature starts to decline in that compost pile. They are starting to die, and they can't work anymore. First, they can't work anymore. Then they start to die because they're suffocating. And so that's why you turn the pile. So the more you turn the pile, the faster you'll get compost.
What about putting a perforated pipe through the middle of the pile? Does that help?
There is a gentleman who came up with that technique, and we had one at school, and I don't know.
Okay, that sounds diplomatic.
You need airflow through there. I don't think it's going to...
I think it clogged up.
Right. I don't think it's going to help a lot because the same process will occur just in different parts of the pile. You can't have enough pipe in it.
What about the ingredients that go into a horse manure compost bin? Do you need other ingredients in order to make it work effectively?
I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know the answer to that either.
We know people, both of us, professional gardeners, who have taken horse manure that has a known diet and put it directly on their garden, fresh. Mm-hmm. We don't know how long it sat around before it was brought to their garden, but it was not put through the composting process. That is something to be very wary of. You have to know what those horses have eaten, because if they eat a seed, it will not break down unless you put it through the composting process. And so you'll end up introducing weeds into your garden, sometimes very noxious weeds like nutsedge.
Or nutgrass. Well, it's the same thing.
Yeah, well, they're close relatives, yeah. The other thing to know is that if you've got a lot of 50 pounds a day, 2 horses, 100 pounds a day, you're going to have a lot of manure, and it attracts lots of things, insects in particular. And you may want to contact an insectary. And there are live organisms that they can mail to you, and you can put in your pile that will naturally kill those insects. Flies in particular are what I'm thinking of.
And one of those critters you can get is soldier fly larvae. They really do a great job in manure reduction, and that can really help you out in your battle to control the pest flies that may be around. The
thing I'm thinking of is a microorganism, a bacteria or fungus of some sort. It's been many years since I've recommended that to someone, and they did it, and it worked great. And I sent them to the insectary called Rincon Vitova, RINCONVITOVA, I believe is the spelling. They have a wonderful website, very knowledgeable people, and they put this friend on a regular mailing based on the number of animals she had, etc., of these live organisms, and she said it worked like a charm. When you use horse manure in the garden, know what those horses have eaten. Know if they've been in a field that has weeds, if the weeds are in the seed stage of life. If they consume seeds, they are very likely to come through in the manure completely alive and in a nice little packet of moisture and nitrogen. And unless composted, those seeds will not break down. Composting at the 140 degree, the very warm, hot composting, we call it, will kill many seeds of weeds, most of them, and leave you with a much more desirable final product for your garden.
Horse manure can be used successfully in the garden to help out your plants, but it's going to take a little bit of work. Go for it, Ken. Debbie Flower, thanks for your help on this.
You're always welcome, Fred.
You've heard me talk about the benefits of Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric container. Smart Pots are sold around the world and are proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Many of the imitators are selling cheaply made fabric pots that fall apart quickly. Not Smart Pots. There are satisfied Smart Pot owners who have been using the same Smart Pots for over a decade, actually approaching 20 years. When you choose Smart Pot fabric containers, you know you'll be having a superior growing experience with the best product on the market. And your plants will appreciate Smart Pots too. Because of the 1 million microscopic holes in Smart Pots, your soil will have better drainage and the roots will be healthier. They won't be going round and round on the outside of the soil ball like you see in so many plastic pots. The air pruning qualities of Smart Pots creates more branching of the roots, filling more of the usable soil in the Smart Pot. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers and select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. You want to start the backyard fruit and nut orchard of your dreams, but maybe you don't know where to begin. Or maybe you're currently growing fruit and nut trees and you've got a million questions, such as what are the tastiest fruits to grow? Where can I go to buy some of these delectable fruit and nut trees you've been reading about? And then how do you care for all of these trees, including planting, pruning, and harvesting? I've got one online stop in mind for you where all these questions you might have will get answered. It's DaveWilson.com. That's Dave Wilson Nursery, the nation's largest wholesaler of fruit and nut trees for the backyard garden. They have planting tips, taste test results, and links to nurseries in your area that carry Dave Wilson fruit trees. Click on the Home Garden tab at DaveWilson.com for all of these links, including a link to their years of informative videos about growing fruit and nut trees that they've posted on the Dave Wilson Nursery YouTube channel. Start the backyard orchard of your dreams at DaveWilson.com. It used to be here in California we had a fire season. Well, not anymore. It seems like every month of the year there's a major wildfire somewhere in the state. But I was surprised to learn that it isn't just California. Well, with climate change and drought and other factors, something like 1 in 6 Americans live in areas with significant wildfire risk. Something like 16% of the country's population today lives in hazardous areas, and that share is just to increase as people move further and further out from cities. It could be up to 21% over the next 30 years. Of course, if you live in the foothills, if you live in a wildland, if you live anywhere near flammable material, you've probably already started taking precautions. But any gardener anywhere, even if you live in a suburb in the middle of a city, you could be exposed to a wildfire. Just talk to the residents of Coffey Park, a suburb of Santa Rosa. In fact, it's right within the city limits of Santa Rosa. Back in October 2017, it was the Tubbs Fire that started 17 miles away up in Calistoga on a Sunday night and swept from Calistoga to the southwest at a pace of about 3 miles an hour, burning up about an acre a minute while spewing burning embers a half mile or more ahead. And that, by the middle of the night, was forcing entire neighborhoods in Santa Rosa to flee. Wind speeds were tracked at somewhere above 60 miles an hour. Embers were flying across Highway 101, a major 4-lane freeway north of San Francisco there in Santa Rosa. And those embers, they think half mile to 1 mile, they were moving. So flying embers is a big thing to consider. And then you got to consider your house and the dead plant material that may be around it. It's not just the flames coming up to your house. It's burning embers flying a half mile or a mile, because storms these days, these firestorms, are developing their own wind patterns, and it's not unusual to have gale force winds involved in wildfire. So wherever you may live, if you can see mountains around you, if you're close to prairie land, if you're close to anything that can burn, you got to consider the thought of how safe is my yard? What do I need to do to my yard? How can you protect your home from wildfire? We bring in an expert. We are talking with Luca Carmignani. He's an assistant fire advisor of the Wildland Urban Interface of the University of California Ag and Natural Resources. And that title, Fire Advisor, is a fairly new one for cooperative extension farm advisors here in California. Unfortunately, they are needed now to aid landowners, homeowners, to assist them in making their home more fire resistant, not just fireproof, but at least fire resistant. So let's bring in Luca Carmignani right now and talk to him about how to protect your home from wildfire. And in Southern California, where you're based, Luca, the fire season now, it's no longer just the summer and the fall. It's year-round. I think there's been a fire down in Southern California every month for the last year.
Yeah, and hi, Fred, and thanks for having me. And you got a great point. Actually, you got two great points. The first one is you mentioned embers, how, we need to think about embers and like how houses can burn. And the second one, the fire season, we were used to having fire seasons from, summer to late fall. And now it's not really a matter of the month. We had, like, here in Orange County, we had a big fire in May that destroyed more than 20 homes in Laguna Niguel. And that was like middle of May with the relatively high level of humidity. So that tells us that, we need to think about fire all year round and not just for a few months a year.
And there have been fires in California in the dead of winter in December and January as well. If you don't have the rain, if you don't have the moisture, it can burn.
Yep, and we've even seen fires in Colorado last winter that definitely was very unusual.
Yeah, you look at a map of where wildfire areas are across the United States, and it's basically every state in the western United States. It goes into the southwest. It goes into the south. All of those areas are wildfire prone. So all these tips that we're going to be talking about today apply to anyone who's near a wildfire area across the United States. I think the only people who might be exempt are our listeners up in the upper Midwest and maybe the New England states. But other than that, wildfires are very widespread. Now, you mentioned a very interesting thing about demonstrations of homes that have been burned by flying embers. And it was a few years ago, it was back in 2011, that the IBHS, which is a research group, an insurance research group, exactly, it is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. They burned a house. They built a house inside this huge warehouse. They put up these huge fans, and then they blew flaming embers through the fans and aimed it at the house. And they had built this house specifically to show the weak points and the strong points, as well as the difference in the fire resistance of building materials. I will have a link to that video where you can see how quickly a home can explode into flames after getting hit by flying embers. And I noticed in that video, the first thing they did to make it look like a typical suburban home is they put in plants and mulch right next to the house. And if there's one thing that we would like to stress, I think, in this little chat of ours, is the fact that you need to take out all vegetation, either alive or dead, within 5 feet of your home.
Yep. And that's correct. And because unfortunately, embers can attack a home like in different ways. They can directly enter the home through, for example, vents or a broken window, or they can ignite all the materials around the house. And once you have, for example, plants right next to the siding of the house that are burning, then you expose the under eaves and the entire roof to the fire. So definitely there can be a lot of escalating effects, and it's important to understand that like you don't want to have flammable materials close to your house. And unfortunately, plants can burn, even so-called fire-resistant plants in situations, for example, typical of fire scenarios, they can burn and they can generate even more embers. They could penetrate the house or penetrate in a little crevice of your deck and then let it ignite. So yes, you're right. It's very important to clean the first zone within 5 feet from your house. That's very important.
Explain the dangers of a fire ladder. Now, people who live in the woods or live in the foothills are aware of low-growing shrubs beneath taller trees, and those shrubs can act as ladders to the upper canopy of the trees. But even next to your house, you could have fire ladders.
Yes, that's correct. And for example, if you have a little bush that is not very tall, but let's say has a lot of dead branches that could burn in case of a fire, that bush would directly expose the under eave of the house or a window, or it could be like close to a vent. So in those situations, that a little bush, even if it's like relatively small, it can threaten the house itself, and it could act as a ladder fuel, basically.
And don't forget all the dead material that could burn that's inside your roof gutters.
Correct. Because it's very important to understand that, like, the roof tends to burn close to the edges. So what do you have at your edges of the roof? Yeah, you have gutters that like contain all the debris, all the leaves, they catch all of it, and if you don't clean it, then these debris can catch on fire. And once you have the fire along the gutter, that's perfect to ignite the entire roof. And that's very destructive, unfortunately. So it's very important to keep gutters clean and maintain the roof free of leaves, for example. If you have trees that are close to your roof, it's very important to keep it clean.
And probably to trim back those trees away from the roof, too.
Yes. There are some studies that show how trees can actually catch the embers, and they don't necessarily cause a fire for the house. But it's also important to understand that if you have a big tree close to your house, one of the branches might break, and that branch might fall on the roof or break a window or something, and that would open a direct path for the fire or embers to get in. So it's very important to trim your vegetation, and nobody asks you to cut down your trees, but it's good to keep a good safe space between the vegetation and the house.
Yeah, I think for landscaping purposes, if you're going to be planting trees around your house to preserve the integrity of the foundation of the house from tree roots, you want to plant that tree probably 15 to 20 feet away from the house. Now, it depends on what type of tree it is and how big that canopy is going to spread. If it is a wide-spreading canopy, you ought to plant it a little further away than that. Another thing that was interesting in that video of the burning house presented by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety was how quickly the gutters ignited. Now, yes, the gutters were filled with debris that caught fire, but the gutters themselves caught fire because they were made of vinyl. And they had two kinds of gutters on this test house. A vinyl gutter on one side and then a aluminum gutter along the other side. And the aluminum gutter was fine. The vinyl gutter went up immediately in flames. Now, even though a vinyl gutter could save you hundreds of dollars if it comes to gutter installation, I think you ought to spend the money on aluminum.
Yeah, that is true. But also with aluminum, you're not going to be safe if you have a lot of leaves on it.
Right.
Because the vinyl gutter will catch on fire and will fall on the ground. So that might ignite like other parts of the house. But if you have an aluminum gutter, it will keep burning if you have leaves inside of it. And so you would directly expose the edge of the roof to a fire. So that's very dangerous. So you're not safe if you have a metal gutter if it's not clean. So it's extremely important to clean the gutters regularly.
I was amazed to learn how easily a wildfire can penetrate through a window, especially a single pane window, which is why double pane windows make a heck of a lot more sense.
Yep, and because unfortunately single pane windows are not very resistant to the heat that is coming from the fire. So for example, if you have something that is burning relatively close to the house, the radiant heat is so-called the one that like reaches you far away from the fire. It can be high enough to like break the single pane window. And if one of the windows break, you basically give the fire a big opening to like burn the house from the inside out. So it's very important to have double pane window, and it's recommended to have at least the outside pane to be tempered glass, because that has like at least four times more resistant than regular glass. Very important to consider that if you have to replace your windows.
Yeah, and speaking of costs, even though vinyl siding might be cheaper, you may want to go to something a little bit more fire resistant.
Yeah, especially if your house is like close to your neighbor's house or to a shed. You know, if you have like another structure that is relatively close, let's say within 30 feet, it's probably better if you have a fire-resistant siding, because that will burn in case of a fire if it's vinyl siding.
A fire-resistant siding, I guess, would have a component of cement in it?
Yeah, there are a lot of different versions for it. Usually like stucco or like other fire-resistant materials can be used. Comes to the fact that like it's important, for example, not to have crevices. Because if you have like a little crevice or a gap or a part that is like broken in the siding, it doesn't matter if it's fire-resistant material, the fire will find a way to burn it. So it's when you think about the siding and like the house itself, you need to consider it in a holistic way and find the weakest point that the fire might burn, basically.
What are some of the common mistakes that you see on family homes?
Unfortunately, I see a lot of issues that could be relatively easily prevented. So most people think that like the roof is the most important aspect of the house, and rightly so, because, you know, it's very exposed to embers and it has a large surface. But if you have like old vents that have like a mesh screen that is like very large, embers could totally penetrate through it and basically ignite the attic or the garage. Or, as I mentioned before, the gutters are very important too. So these are two things that can be easily addressed by a homeowner. For the gutters, as we said before, you just need to regularly clean them. And for the vents, you can either try to retrofit them. There are at the hardware stores metal covers that you can put on top of your vents to make them fire resistant. Or the simplest thing that you can do is to prepare covers made of plywood or metal, for example, that you can put on the vents before evacuation if you have to leave your house. Of course, if it's safe to do so. But definitely closing those gaps is extremely important to prevent the house from burning down.
Yeah, you'd almost need to install shutters around your vents in order to be able to close them quickly while you're evacuating. Yep.
And or prepare metal covers or something that you can just use to like block the flow through the vents, basically.
Yeah, that video I was talking about that demonstrated what a fire blowing embers can do. They showed what happens when embers blow through the typical gable that has 1/8 inch screen mesh protecting it, basically to keep the bugs out. Sparks came right in. They were suggesting you want to use a 1/16 inch mesh, but that may require more maintenance.
Yeah, correct, because that could get clogged with paint, for example, or with some material like debris. So, if you have like a very small mesh, like 1/16 of an inch, you need to be careful and keep an eye on it. And if you have like larger mesh, for example, like 1/4 of an inch, then the embers can easily go through and ignite whatever is on the other side. And that's also important, for example, if you have a garage where we usually store all of the flammable material, we have paint, we have all sort of things. So if embers get to the garage, then it's a big issue.
Yeah, that speaking of flammable materials on property, I'm thinking of when I lived in the country, all the people with propane tanks that even though they were the required distance from the house, they were usually under trees or in some sort of flammable area. And if those tanks exploded, it doesn't matter that it's 30 feet away.
Yep, that's correct.
Another thing that people don't realize, too, when they're building their dream home in the hills is they think if they're on the top of the hill, they're safe from fire because all the vegetation is below them. I don't think they realize that fire and wind moves uphill.
Yeah, that's quite the opposite, actually. If your house is on top of the hill, well, first of all, you're pretty lucky because you probably have a great view. But that's very dangerous in terms of embers, and like if you have a fire, let's say at the bottom of the hill, and the fire moves along a vertical slope, that's very dangerous scenario because the fire can move really fast and generate a lot of embers, and the embers are accelerated by the topography, basically by the landscape. And they can really get basically shot higher up in the air and reach even farther away houses. And that's exactly the case of the fire here that we had in Orange County, the coastal fire, where basically the houses were on top of a hill and the fire spread through a canyon. And within an hour, less than 2 hours, all the houses were already on fire. So, and there were no flame contacts. It was like a pure ember issue. And those embers came from the bottom of the hill, not from the top. So yeah, unfortunately, top of the hill doesn't mean you're safe. Actually, you might even be in more trouble.
Let's talk about narrow roadways too. I'm always amazed in fire-prone hillsides in the foothills and deeper into the mountains, how narrow the roads get, how narrow the driveways are. How the heck is a fireman supposed to save your house if he can't get to it?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's also why it's important to leave room within 5 feet from your house. So if emergency responders have to protect your property, they have room to act. And again, the road and the situation of the access to your property is very important, but it's also crucial to understand that, in a situation where there's a lot of houses burning, the emergency responders might need to prioritize their effort for evacuating people or helping people in need, and they might not have the resources to extinguish the fire. That's why it's so important to have a fire-resilient house in case the firefighters or other emergency responders cannot act to protect it. And in that way, you can only count on passive strategy.
Of the fire professionals I've talked to, they are most reluctant in a situation where they can pick and choose the house they can save. They're very reluctant to go down a driveway that is lined with trees on either side. And they are really leery of those narrow side yards you were talking about, especially if there's a wooden fence dividing the two adjacent properties. Because those narrow side yards, which sometimes are only 4, 6, 8 feet wide, if that fence is on fire, no fireman's going to walk down that area.
Yep, that's very correct. And that's why, when we talk about being fire resilient, we think more about a community effort and not just as a single property owner effort, because it has to account in all of the, these scenarios where, for example, the firefighters need to go through the yards or past fences and so on. So it's very important to talk to your neighbors and think in advance about what could happen in the case of a fire.
When we had the acreage, one of the first things I did was to install an alternate driveway, not the main driveway, but an alternate driveway that was a width that was wide enough to hold basically 2 fire engines and have it go to a gate on the main street. And that gate was a chain link fence because chain link isn't going to burn.
Yep. And that's right. I mean, also the fences material is very important because in a lot of cases, people kind of underestimate the importance of fences. But besides being an obstacle for emergency responders, they can really determine the survival rate of a house. For example, if you have a fence that is made of wood and is attached to the house wall, the fire could spread through the fence and reach the house. So that would actually make it worse. And not only for access, but also for the fire resistance itself.
Yeah, that would make sense for any gate to be made out of non-flammable material.
Yeah, like a metal gate. I understand that there's aesthetic issues, but I feel that there's plenty of alternatives, to find an option for a gate or a separation between the fence and the house wall that you can use to make it look nice and at the same time fire resistant.
One thing I see in a lot of these fire demonstration videos that I'm sure people don't think about is the amount of debris that might be under a deck leading to a door, or the amount of debris just around the house that should be cleaned up.
Yes. Unfortunately, depending on the deck, it can be really hard sometimes to clean underneath it or, in between the boards. But it's extremely important to do it because areas where you have some air flow, and embers could jump in, those are perfect for igniting the material. Because the fire loves situations like that where it can sneak in and basically ignite a little debris or leaves or organic material and then ignite the bigger components. For example, the boards of the deck, and then from the deck you get the house ignition. So yes, cleaning up the areas around the house, underneath the deck, and for example, between the deck boards is very, very important.
We talked about taking out the vegetation that's within 5 feet of your home and also mulch. People don't realize that most organic mulches, like bark, can burn or at least smolder, and they're not going to stop a fire. And so what are the alternatives? Does it have to be a rock mulch?
Well, mulch is a big issue because it was promoted a lot in terms of water conservancy because it's very good to retain moisture from the soil. And so you can see it in a lot of houses that is right along all the border of the outline of the house. And that's very, very dangerous because, as you mentioned, it can catch on fire. And it might smolder at the beginning, but when the smoldering is strong enough, then it can transition to flaming and ignite other components. So there are some alternatives. According to one recent study, actually, there's a lot of problems related to mulch, but there are some alternatives that you can act. For example, having bigger pieces for the mulch instead of having finer material. That could help, for example, preventing ignition. But overall, it's great to keep it away from the house.
So if I'm thinking of making my home more fire safe from burning embers, so if I've cleared out the first 5 feet, what is the depth of the next zone? I guess that's where I should build my circular driveway.
The official zones right now are only 2. The first one is from 0 to 30 feet, and then you have from 30 to 100 feet from your house. But in a few months, I believe in January, the new standard will come into place where basically there's going to be 3 zones. The 0 to 5 feet is zone 0, and then you have 5 to 30 feet is zone 1, and then 30 to 100. So in that zone 1, you don't want to have the ladder fuels that you mentioned earlier. So fuels that could ignite and then ignite other bigger components. But the requirements are not super strict. And also there's a lot of variation from property to property. And if you look at the regulations, CAL FIRE will never ask you to remove a tree, for example. But there are some things that you can do, for example, trimming the plants or removing the dead branches or like all the dead parts of the trees that could catch on fire. And those things could really help you making your house resistant.
Yeah, and I guess if you're planting new trees, if you want to plant a lot of trees on your property that are, especially in the zone beyond 30 feet or so, when you're planting those trees, there probably should be about 12 feet at least between trees.
Yeah. And of course, it depends on the size of the tree and the kind of the tree. If your tree is, has a lot of resin, they're very flammable, so you might not want to put more than one. But definitely there are some trees that you can look up that are like safer than others. For example, here in Southern California, a lot of utility companies or local agencies provide a list of trees that are relatively safe to plant around your house. So you can start from those guidelines and kind of like get their feedback too. Usually local agencies like fire authorities and so on are more than happy to provide you feedback and help in planning and planting the vegetation in order to have like a fire resistant landscape.
So give us some examples of trees that are more fire resistant.
So one example that comes to my mind is a tree that has been promoted by San Diego Gas and Electric. It's the crepe myrtle. And that tree is really good in terms of like water efficiency, but also is a tree that doesn't grow too tall, for example. So if you have a power line that is close by, it wouldn't affect it. Or it's something that you can prune easily and keep it like contained. Those are examples of trees that you can plant. And I know for sure that, for example, San Diego Gas and Electric has a list of like 5 or 6 species that are determined safe. But there's plenty more that you can plant.
Yeah, the crepe myrtle is an excellent summer blooming tree. And like you say, it gets maybe 25 to 35 feet tall. It actually has a fairly wide range for California and other parts of the country as well. The crepe myrtle, because it is a smaller tree, makes sense as being more suitable for a small backyard.
Yeah, and it's very beautiful when it has all the flowers on.
Exactly, and unless you have to clean them up. Now, one problem with a crepe myrtle, and this is true of a lot of trees, is they sprout from the base, and you have to keep those sprouts pruned off in order to not create a fire ladder.
Yeah, that is true. But in those situations, what you're really concerned about is not necessarily the sprouting, but all the dead material that accumulates around the tree. Because if you have all the sprouts at the base, it might be harder to remove all the dead leaves or all the little small branches. So that's something that you should focus on, because those are the materials that would ignite in case of a fire. If you have like a green branch, very likely it's not going to ignite right away unless it has something else close by that it's burning.
There are plenty of shrubs that do a great job of hiding their dead material beneath the plant, and it's worth your while to get in there with a rake and remove that dead material.
Yeah, and one big example is acacia that is very popular because it doesn't require a lot of water and it looks nice. And unfortunately, if you look underneath those bushes, there's a lot of flammable branches and like dead leaves, and those small branches just act like kindles, basically.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of California natives that have that problem, and you've got to pick them very carefully.
Well, yeah, on the native plants, that's a little bit a different subject because native plants most of them are adapted to fire. So some of them actually want the fire. And that's also why they're flammable themselves. Having native plants far apart could help. And definitely, there are a lot of different native plants that you can use. So you can look up, for example, the Master Gardeners programs or other programs from the University of California Cooperative Extension, and they usually provide you with guidelines for your specific landscape. Because of course, it also depends on where you are.
Exactly. But there are master gardener groups, there are cooperative extension offices in every state. And if you're in a fire-prone area, I bet your cooperative extension office or local university has a list of appropriate plants for such a situation.
Yeah, that's correct. It's important too, it's not just for the plant, but also what is the moisture content of the plant, and can it burn better if you irrigate it less? Well, that's something that we don't really know. So part of my research will look at to this aspect.
In this age of drought, especially here in California, lawns are not a very popular topic. However, lawns are fire resistant if maintained and kept green.
Yes, that's true, because grass is very fine. So when you go with those very fine materials, sometimes you get the opposite effect. They don't burn, especially because they have a lot of water if they're well irrigated. But yeah, unfortunately, they're not very water friendly, especially in Southern California.
I really see the value if you live in a fire-prone area in that wildfire urban interface of having a swimming pool to separate your house from the wildland.
A nice excuse to have a swimming pool.
Yeah.
But, I mean, unfortunately, here in Orange County, several of the houses that burned down in the coastal fire in May had a swimming pool in front of their houses, and very big swimming pool. But that didn't protect their houses from burning down, and not because, because the flames didn't reach the houses. It's the embers that reached the houses. So in that situation, having a swimming pool doesn't really play an effect.
One reason we had a pool and we lived in a wildfire-prone area, we also had a generator. Because once the fire gets going, chances are the electricity is going to disappear. So maybe having a generator along with a pump that you can drop in a pool and start the generator and then turn on roof sprinklers. Are roof sprinklers worth the investment?
Well, in that situation, if the sprinkles can directly protect your house, they can give you some time. They might not save the house, but they can give you some extra time needed by the firefighters, like reach the property, for example, and actively put out the fire. So if you're talking about lawn sprinklers, they're not helpful at all. But if you have like the actual sprinklers that are used like in warehouses or in residential properties, they can be very helpful, at least for like gaining some time.
Right. I was actually thinking of just running PVC pipes up to the roof and installing sprinklers up on the roof.
I mean, that sounds like a big project, but, that could help. The problem though is that, if the embers if embers or flame somehow gets to the inside of the house, then, it's too late and the sprinklers won't be very effective.
Well, that too. And if the embers ignite somehow on the side of the house, it could melt the PVC pipe.
Yeah, that's correct.
There goes that theory. Well, I tried. One thing a lot of homes have are chimneys. And I wonder how many of these chimneys have the proper spark arrestor on them.
Well, that's a good point because, if you have chimneys or a complex roof with like vertical intersections of the roof, those are problematic because they usually accumulate all the debris, all the leaves, they end up there. So they could be ignited by embers, for example. So first of all, it's very important to keep those areas clean. And also, embers could directly ignite, for example, the intersections if you have a little crevice or if the roof is a little bit older. So what you can do in those situations is install metal flashing at the intersection, and that could really, really help not only for water damage, but also for fire resistance.
So it's all about having defensible space for your home. Defensible space. It's careful selection, location, and maintenance of vegetation and other combustible materials on your property. You want to minimize the pathways of wildfire to burn directly to your home. You want to reduce the radiant heat exposures to the home and structures, like with that metal flashing, reducing the potential for embers to ignite vegetation adjacent to the home by basically removing all vegetation within 5 feet of the home, and also making it a safe place for fire personnel to defend the home and allow for safe routes for evacuation. We've been talking with Luca Carmignani, Assistant Fire Advisor, the Wildland Urban Interface of the University of California Ag and Natural Resources. No matter where you live, if you're in a wildfire area, no doubt you have a cooperative extension office or an advisor or a university that also has people like Luca on board to help you out, making your home more fire resistant. Luca Carmignani, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. And if you want more information about what we do, you can check the UCANR website. And if you Google UCANR Fire, the first website that will come up is our website, where we have all of this information that we talked about today.
There you go, UCANR Fire. Thank you, Luca.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
In today's Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast, we talk with Douglas Kent. He's the author of the book Firescaping, Protecting Your Home with a Fire-Resistant Landscape. He has another view of thwarting home and yard damage for residents of the urban wildland interface, property owners who are increasingly keeping a wary eye and nose in the air for smoke. But as we pointed out in the Garden Basics podcast this week in episode 235, it's the threat not so much from flames creeping onto your property. It's more like blowing, burning embers hurtling towards your house from a wind-driven wildfire. Those embers, which are also called firebrands, can travel a half mile or more from the actual fire itself. Their ferocity is supercharged by winds that can reach 60 miles an hour or more. And it's not just California. States throughout the West, Northwest, Southwest, Intermountain West, and the South have been hit by massive wildfires. The Washington Post estimates that 16% of all Americans on 80 million properties face the threat of wildfire. You can read it and hear it on the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. Find a link to it in today's show notes or visit our website, gardenbasics.net, where you can sign up to have the free Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast delivered to your inbox each Friday. Also at gardenbasics.net, you can listen to any of our previous editions of the Garden Basics podcast, as well as read a transcript of the podcast episode that you're listening to now. For current newsletter subscribers, look for the episode entitled Firescaping. It's in the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. Now available, you'll get it in your email. Take a deeper dive into gardening with the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. It's free. Find the link in today's show notes at gardenbasics.net. The Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast comes out once a week on Fridays. Plus, the newsletter podcast that comes with the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter continues, and that will also be released on Fridays. Both are free, and they're brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. The Garden Basics podcast is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes our homepage, gardenbasics.net. And that's where you can also sign up for the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. That's gardenbasics.net, or you can use the links in today's show notes. And thank you so much for listening.